It was the winter of 1944 when we rolled into the ruins of yet another nameless village somewhere between the Ardennes and nothingness, our breath forming ghosts in the air thick with the scent of defeat and diesel. I had been a mechanic for the Wehrmacht since before this cursed war swallowed Europe, fixing trucks and half-tracks as if each bolt could hold the Reich together a little longer. But that morning, as frost crackled beneath our boots and the distant thunder of artillery faded into a lonely hum, we stumbled upon something I would never forget, a ghost from another army, standing half buried in snow like some American beast that had strayed too far from home. It was a GMC truck, its olive green body scorched but intact, its tires half sunk in mud frozen as hard as stone, and on its side, faint letters that looked like they belonged to men who still believed they could change the world. The sergeant barked, "Get it running, Dieter. We'll take their own wheels back to them." I wanted to laugh but didn't. I just looked at the machine, silent and sturdy, and thought how strange it seemed that even the enemy's steel looked more alive than ours did. While others saw a trophy, I saw a passing shadow of something much larger, a quiet proof whispered in gears and rubber that we, proud sons of the fatherland, had already lost long before the first shell fell. I remember prying open the hood with stiff fingers, the hinges groaning like an old man's knees. Inside, I found a heart too clean, too cleverly made. The Americans built things differently, simpler, smarter. Every wire was labeled, every fuse reachable, everything designed not just for battle but for men who might be tired, scared, half-trained. Our machinery was precise but fragile, demanding, almost arrogant in its perfection. Their machines, though less elegant, forgave you for being human. As I worked, I realized how deep that difference cut. Around me, my comrades joked about taking this truck to Berlin, painting iron crosses on its side. But as the engine growled back to life, low, even, steady, I felt a chill deeper than the winter's wind. That sound didn't belong to us. It was the sound of an army that could replace what it lost, an army that didn't need to be perfect to win. Our firepower, our tanks, even our certainty, all of it suddenly seemed like expensive lies built on borrowed time. Hours passed as the sky dimmed into a bruised purple, and when orders came to move out, the sergeant let me drive. The seat was rough, high, textured with American grit. I held the wheel as if touching the future, one that didn't include me. Directionless, the convoy moved eastward, weary and slower each day, like wounded animals refusing to die. Broken villages rolled by, their silence heavier than any sermon, their chimneys skeletal against the dusk. Inside that captured truck, I felt both pride and shame, pride that it obeyed me, shame that it did so perfectly. Somewhere beyond the fog and the blown bridges, I imagined American boys laughing over cigarettes, their supply lines swelling like arteries pulsing with victory. We had no such rhythm left. Fuel was scarce, spare parts rarer, hope almost extinct. Every meter we traveled felt stolen from reality itself. When the first snow began to fall soft and slow, I glanced through the frost-flecked windshield and wondered if the war even cared who won anymore. That night, we camped near the shell of an old barn, the horses long gone, the hay long rotted. I crouched by the GMC's engine, studying its every bolt under the dim glow of a lantern, as though it held some secret code that might save us. It hit me then, this wasn't just a truck. It was a message. Every practical angle, every efficient weld, spoke of a nation that valued the soldier's life enough to build for it. In our factories, efficiency served ideology. In theirs, it served survival. That difference would decide everything. I had been taught to believe that German craftsmanship was unmatched, that our engineers were gods among men. But staring at that American engine, ticking softly in the darkness like a heart at rest, I knew those gods had already fallen. Behind me, I heard Lieutenant Weber muttering over a map, talking about counteroffensives, some last push our generals promised would turn the tide. I no longer believed in tides. Only currents, dragging us all toward the same abyss. The truck's headlights flickered, reflecting off snowflakes that looked, for an instant, like ash. I thought of home, Bremen, the workshops, my father's words before the war swallowed him too. Machines serve truth, he used to say. And truth always wins in the end. Maybe that's why the enemy kept building, kept moving, kept winning, because their machines told a truer story than ours ever could. When dawn came, I heard distant American engines, a low chorus rolling from the west. And in that moment, beside our single stolen truck, I understood what no propaganda could cover up: the war was no longer about courage or faith or banners waving over ruins. It was about who could build something that lasted just long enough to carry a man home. And we couldn't. The forests grew darker the farther I went, as if the trees had gathered to hide the last remnants of a broken nation. The road wound like a scar, uneven and half-frozen, and the truck's tires slipped over the ice with stubborn determination. I no longer drove for orders or country or even survival. I drove because motion was the only thing separating me from silence. The radio was dead, the maps meaningless. The world had shrunk to the glow of the GMC's headlights cutting through curtains of snow. Somewhere beyond those curtains, an empire had fallen, but I hadn't seen it yet. Part of me refused to believe something so vast could die without at least a sound. That night, I reached a farmhouse still standing, its windows shattered, yet its chimney miraculously alive with smoke. Inside, an old woman and her grandson shared their last bread by the fire. They didn't flinch when they saw my uniform. The boy just asked if I had seen any Americans nearby. His voice was soft, hopeful, not afraid. I told him no. In truth, I had seen their tracks days ago, tread marks wide and strong, like they belonged to men who still believed in tomorrow. The old woman poured me a cup of weak broth, staring at the steam as if it could show her the faces of the dead. "It's over," she whispered. "You boys just don't know it yet." She was right. I tried to sleep by the fire, but the engine outside kept calling me, murmuring through the cold like something alive that didn't know how to stop. Before dawn, I left quietly, leaving my share of bread on the table. The road east was empty. Snow had buried everything: signs, fences, even the scars of battle. I began to imagine that I was the last man on earth, driving a machine built by strangers toward a future none of us would ever see. The fuel gauge dipped lower every mile. I passed the wreckage of what had once been a German convoy, iron twisted like paper, faces frozen where they fell. In one of the trucks, I saw a mirror still reflecting the sky, unbroken. For a while, I followed a line of telephone poles until they ended abruptly at a bomb crater. That's when I heard it, the same kind of engine as mine, faint and steady, somewhere ahead. I pushed forward. Through the trees, I saw them, 2 American soldiers struggling to haul another GMC out of a ditch. My heart pounded. For a moment, instinct screamed for me to turn, to hide, to vanish back into the woods. But I didn't. Maybe I was tired of hiding, or maybe I just wanted to see what the world looked like on the other side of defeat. I cut the engine and stepped out, hands raised. The Americans froze, rifles half-raised, their faces young and sunburned despite the cold. One of them yelled something I didn't understand, but when he saw the exhaustion in my eyes, he lowered his weapon. None of us spoke for a while. The wind did all the talking. Then his comrade pointed at my truck and laughed softly. "Ours?" he asked. I nodded. He laughed again, more gently this time, and said something about good machines. We didn't shake hands, war wasn't done enough for that, but something in that quiet moment felt heavier than any surrender. I helped them pull their truck from the ditch. They didn't stop me. Maybe they knew I wasn't really their enemy anymore. When their engine roared to life, the taller one looked at my truck and then at me. "Keep it," he said, before driving off into the fog. I stood there long after they disappeared, staring at the space where they'd been. I climbed back into the seat, pressed the ignition, and for once, I didn't think about home or victory or shame. I just drove west, yes, west, toward where the sound of distant laughter and engines echoed across the frozen earth. Days blurred into one another, snow giving way to thaw, the air smelling faintly of spring and smoke. Villages began to appear again, not German or American anymore, just human. Farmers came out of hiding, children played in the mud, and I began to see faces that no longer looked frightened. Somewhere past the Rhine, I finally stopped. The fuel was gone, the tires thin as paper. I climbed out and touched the hood one last time. It was still warm, still faithful. I sat beside it until the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, and I realized that this machine had carried me not across a country, but across myself. In the distance, I heard church bells ringing for peace. I closed my eyes, imagining my father smiling somewhere behind the noise, whispering his truth again: machines serve truth, and truth always wins. As the last light slipped behind the hills, I took the key from the ignition and placed it gently in the snow. The truck exhaled one final sigh, metal ticking quietly as it cooled. I walked away without looking back, feeling the weight of silence settle around me like forgiveness. Behind me, the captured GMC stood still against the sunset, a monument not to conquest or defeat, but to understanding. The war had ended not with a shout, but with the low hum of an American engine dying gently in a German winter. And somehow, that seemed right. The snow kept falling as if the sky itself had run out of mercy, blanketing everything in a colorless silence that made even the crack of a distant rifle sound like memory instead of war. By then, the GMC had become the heart of our little convoy, the machine that refused to die even when the cold sank its teeth into everything else. I drove through nights so long they felt like years, tracing roads that no longer existed on the lieutenant's maps. We were ghost soldiers now, scattered survivors of battles no one would remember, dragging our war behind us like a corpse we couldn't bury. The truck carried us past wrecked panthers and frozen horses, past fields turned to glass under artillery fire, past the skeletons of our own ambition. Each morning, someone new was missing. Sometimes they froze before dawn, sometimes they just walked into the fog and never came back. And still the GMC kept running. The engine's steady hum was the only thing left in the world that sounded alive. One evening, we stopped near a half-collapsed bridge, steel twisted like a giant's broken ribs, and tried to decide whether to cross on foot or wait for clearer skies. The sergeant was losing hope, his hands shaking as he lit a cigarette that he never finished. I pretended to check the oil but was really just listening to the truck's quiet breathing. It didn't care about borders or orders or the dreams of old men playing gods. It just ran. For the first time, I envied a machine. Across the river, in the faint light of burning farms, we caught glimpses of movement, shadows crawling through the smoke. It wasn't certain whether they were Germans or Americans. By then, it hardly mattered. The war had become something shapeless, a storm in which uniforms meant nothing. That night, as we huddled in the truck bed for warmth, I found a small metal plaque behind the seat, stamped with fading letters, "Built in Michigan, 1943. I traced it with my glove and thought about the hands that had made this engine, the workers, the women, the mechanics. Somewhere far away from the front lines, they'd built a machine that would outlive us all. I tried to imagine their world, safe and lit, where factories hummed and trains ran on time, where people still believed tomorrow would be better. I wondered if they ever thought about where their trucks ended up, about the frostbitten German boy now keeping his last heartbeat close to their creation. By morning, the sergeant decided we'd move east. He hoped to find a larger unit, maybe link up with reinforcements near Cologne. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the front had already collapsed. We spent the day crossing ghost towns, their streets littered with frost and promises. In one of them, I saw a church still standing, its bell cracked but upright. I stopped the truck for a moment and stared at the cross silhouetted against the pale sun. It looked less like salvation and more like surrender. As we moved on, we passed columns of refugees, old women dragging suitcases, children too tired to cry, men limping with eyes already hollowed of meaning. When they saw our uniforms, they didn't curse or plead. They just stepped aside, quiet, like people moving out of the way for the wind. The lieutenant kept muttering about pushing through to Berlin, his voice trembling with a faith even he didn't believe anymore. The snow had started to glow blue under the falling dusk, and I remember thinking that the world looked too beautiful for what we were doing to it. Then, as if to remind us we were still hunted, the whine of an aircraft tore through the quiet. We dived into the ditch, and seconds later the air erupted into splinters and flame. I felt heat on my face, smoke in my lungs, and when it cleared, the truck was on fire. My heart stopped. Not because I feared death, I stopped fearing that long ago, but because that engine, that symbol of everything I didn't want to understand, was dying like everything else around me. We worked frantically to save it, throwing handfuls of snow and scraping burning tar with our coats. Somehow, as if determined to prove a point, the GMC lived. The fire sputtered out, and though the front half was scorched black, the engine still turned over, coughing like an old man refusing to give up his breath. That moment felt holy, in a strange, godless way. I looked at the sergeant, and for a heartbeat, we both smiled, a tired, broken smile that had nothing to do with victory. From then on, I began talking to the truck like it was a comrade. I told it things I hadn't told a living soul, about my brother Hans lost in Stalingrad, about the girl I promised to marry when the war ended, about the way I used to believe in the empire as if it were a dream worth dying for. The truck never answered, only kept moving forward, no matter how broken the road became. When we crossed into a forest outside Aachen, I realized something strange. The engine was louder now, echoing through the trees like a heartbeat against the night. Maybe it was just the echo of another army closing in, or maybe it was everything I had left of hope. By the time we stopped again, the sergeant was gone. He'd taken the first watch and never returned. Maybe he'd gone to find surrender, or peace, or God. I sat in the truck for hours, revolver in hand, listening to the engine idle softly in the cold. Dawn spilled over the treetops, and with it came a silence deeper than death. I could have abandoned the truck, left it there like everything else we'd lost, but I couldn't. Because as long as that engine ran, so did I. I pressed the pedal and drove east, toward ruins I already knew by heart, chasing a war that had ended long before we realized it. Years have passed, and the world has grown quieter, the fields have healed, grass now hiding the scars of old battles, children laughing where soldiers once marched. Sometimes, on sleep-heavy nights, I still hear the engines hum vibrating through empty streets, an echoed heartbeat from a war that promised much and delivered only lessons in loss. I live now in the shadow of peace, working as a mechanic in a small town that barely remembers which side its fathers were on. The GMC truck is far away, perhaps rusting beneath open sky, or maybe, though I sometimes pray it's true, serving on in someone else's story, its engine whispering hope instead of orders. In the workshop, young men bring me their broken scooters and bicycles, their faces bright with futures unscarred by war. I teach them about engines, about wires and bolts, but as I guide their hands, what I really hope to show them is something deeper, how machines, and men, are strongest when built not just for conquest or pride or even survival, but for care, for connection, for truth. I look out my window at dusk, and the last light catches a glimmer of old metal half buried beneath wildflowers. For a moment, memories sharpen, and I am back on frozen roads, listening to the faithful hum of a captured truck, knowing, at last, that surrender is not weakness but the beginning of understanding. The war was lost, yes, but what I found on that winding journey was something neither army could claim, the quiet enduring legacy of whatever we build with our hands and our hope. The world turns, the snow melts, spring always comes again, and somewhere out there, an engine waits to be heard by someone willing to listen, knowing the journey doesn't end when the road does, it ends when we remember what truly matters.